Hey. Hi everyone. My name is Rebecca Edwards and I'm the curator at Arebyte Gallery in London, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this exciting conversation tonight. For those of you unfamiliar with Arebyte, we are a digital new media space dedicated to commissioning and presenting works by artists working within the digital realm. We offer new forms of engagement with creative technologies to critically explore the impact of technology in contemporary society. The discussion tonight revolves around Zach Blas's current exhibition with us called CULTUS. It's the second installment in his Silicon Traces trilogy, and we'll delve further into themes within the work, such as the ways in which religion, spirituality, and belief influence the role that AI plays in our lives. We are joined tonight by Tao Pan and Mashinka Ferenc Hakopian, welcome both, who will present areas of their research first before we get into the conversation. Unfortunately, we're missing anthropologist Beth Singler tonight due to illness. So Beth, we wish you a speedy recovery and sorry not to have your voice in the conversation. But to introduce Tao and Mashinka, Tao Pan is a feminist science and technology studies researcher who specializes in the study of gender and race in algorithmic culture. She is a research fellow in the Australian Research Council's Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision-Making and Society and the Emerging Technologies Research Lab at Monash University in Australia. Tao has published on topics including the aesthetics of digital voice assistants, big data-driven techniques of racial classification, and the commercial capture of AI ethics research. Mashinka Ferenc Hakopian is a writer, artist, and researcher born in Yerevan and residing in Glendale, California. She is Associate Professor of Technology and Social Justice at Art Center College of Design and was a 2021 visiting Mellon Professor of the practice at Occidental College. There, she co-created the exhibition Encoding Futures, Critical Imaginaries of AI with Meldia Yesayan at Oxy Arts. And it traveled to New York in September 2023 under the title What Models Make Worlds. Her book, The Institute for Other Intelligences, was released by X Artist Books in 2022 and takes the form of documentation from a fictional symposium held by and for AI and other intelligences. The resulting manuscript, published on the occasion of the Institute's millennial anniversary, revisits socio-technical systems from its founding in the 21st century. Finally, Zach Blas is an artist, filmmaker, and writer whose practice spans moving image, computation, theory, performance, and science fiction. Recent artworks have addressed AI religiosity, the crystal balls of Silicon Valley, BDSM and surveillance, and smart drug psychedelia. Today, we embark on a profound journey to unravel the complex tapestry woven by the convergence of these diverse yet deeply interconnected realms. In an era where technological advancements redefine the very fabric of our existence, it becomes imperative to scrutinize how our spiritual beliefs, our beliefs in general, our gender perspectives, and anti-racist ideologies intersect with the evolving landscape of AI. At the heart of our discussion tonight lies a fundamental question. How do religion, spirituality, and belief systems inform the roles that AI play in our societies? From the ethical considerations surrounding the creation of AI to its implications for human dignity and moral agency, the interplay between faith and technology offers fertile ground for exploration and introspection. If any questions pop up during the discussion tonight, please feel free to drop them in the live chat on YouTube and we'll get to them at the end. But for now, Zach, I'll hand over to you.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. I'd like to thank Rebecca and Anshul and everyone at Arebyte for organizing this event, making it happen. We're working across complex time zones, so I'm glad we were able to make it happen. And a big thanks to Mashinka and Tao for joining me and agreeing to be in conversation. Absolute pleasure and delight. So let me start by sharing my screen quickly. Okay, you should be seeing a documentation image of cultus. So I really just want to bring forward some core ideas that are floating around this artwork for me. And maybe I should preface that by saying I'm also giving a talk next week with Arbite where I'll do a much deeper dive into some of the research around cultus. But for now, I'd like to take a moment to situate this work and then pull out a few concepts that are around it that I also think could intersect nicely with Mashinka's work and Tao's as well. So you're looking at a documentation image of cultus, and cultus is the second installment, as Rebecca pointed out, of my Silicon Traces trilogy, which I think of as a series of moving image installations that contend with beliefs, fantasies, and histories that are influential to Silicon Valley's visions of the future and how those visions of the future are marshaled into certain types of control apparatuses, structures. Um, so the first work in this trilogy actually also premiered in London a number of years ago in 2017 at Gasworks, and this was a queer science fiction film installation called Contra Intranet Jubilee 2033, which was in part a reimagining of scenes from Derek Jarman's 1978, I think that's the date, film, Jubilee, in which Queen Elizabeth time travels into a post-apocalyptic England, which was Jarman's present, and kind of bears wreckage to the state of the British Empire. In my film, we it's not about the future of England, as in Jarman's, it's about the future of the internet. And so our main character is not the Queen of England, but rather who at the time I was thinking is the philosophical queen of Silicon Valley, Ayn Rand, who is a very popular novelist and philosopher, if you will, who worked in the US. I'll touch more on her later, but in my film, Ayn Rand is holding a meeting with some of her followers in the 1950s. She's visited by an artificial intelligence that enables her to time travel to a future California that's being, or future Silicon Valley that's being overthrown by queer militants. And uh, this film was very much about trying to articulate a desire or a longing for something other than the internet as we know it. And at the time, I was thinking with different feminist and queer theorists, writers like J.K. Gibson Graham, who critiqued the inability of the Marxist left to imagine an outside to capital, as well as a trans queer theorist like Paul Preciado, who developed this idea of contrasexuality as a way to articulate a non-normative, non-naturalized understanding of sexuality. So this idea of the contra-intranet was very much trying to articulate some type of horizon of possibility, desire beyond the corporate Silicon Valley internet as we know it. Part two of this trilogy, or sorry, this is, I should say, clarify that Contra Intranet Jubilee 2033 was the prologue of this trilogy. And this work, The Doors, is the first work in the trilogy, and it premiered in 2019 at the Edith Rust House in Oldenburg, Germany. And this work was very much looking at the legacies of psychedelia within California culture and the tech industry, as well as thinking, engaging with the present state of psychedelic culture. And really at the core of this work, there was an interest in looking at the growing popularity of microdosing on psilocybin mushrooms and LSD, as well as the burgeoning nootropics industry, to think about, of course, a long, complicated, entangled history of tech culture, counterculture, entrepreneurialism around psychedelics, but also to think that we've kind of entered a different era of psychedelic culture where we have the microdosing, in a sense, re-engineering psychedelic drugs to be worker productivity drugs. And of course, the way that the nootropics industry plugs into that conception as well. So this artwork tapped into different kind of mythologies around California through The Doors, looking at Jim Morrison, thinking about lizards in California culture, but also kind of alt-right conspiracy theory landscapes where lizards currently roam on the internet. And this work was meant to kind of give one an experience of what it might feel like to be on a psychedelic trip fueled by nootropics. So part two of this trilogy is Cultus, which is currently at Arbite. And So this work shifts from looking at psychedelics to religion. And really at the core of this work is thinking about how there is a religious dynamic of power within the tech industry and just how the doors is kind of setting with that power structure and trying to kind of surface and pull out these dynamics. This is very much what cultus is doing. So just to give some kind of points of reference for this, because yeah, if you haven't been thinking about this for years, like I have, maybe the connection of religion and artificial intelligence might sound somewhat confusing, but there are examples of this. Let me just jump ahead here to an organization like Way of the Future, which was achieved in 2017 by ex-Google employee Anthony Lewandowski that was organized around worshiping a coming AI god. So Way of the Future might be a kind of wacky example, but it kind of um, makes this connection that California has long been this place where you have a history of countercultural religions, fringe religions, occult activity, different types of spirituality, new age spirituality, active, and that this church, the Way of the Future, is really just very well situated within that trajectory of history of religion and spirituality within Silicon Valley. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is that on the surface, this might seem like this idea of a church forming and worshiping AI gods might seem absolutely ridiculous, but if you look within California culture, it actually kind of perfectly fits within that trajectory and is not surprising at all that something like this would materialize there. But let me just back to this concept that I skipped over for a second. And um, I guess one idea I wanted to put forward when I started making Cultus and trying to create this artwork that is about giving people some kind of mediated access to AI gods, their teachings, their beliefs, is working from this idea of the religious unconscious. And I take this idea from the Marxist literary scholar Friedrich Jameson in an early book of his called The Political Unconscious, which was written in the 1980s. Jameson made the argument that a work of literature is never purely just literary, that there's always a political dimension within a work of literature, and that to only perform a formal analysis, if you will, in a work of literature would be possibly to miss out on one of its most important dimensions, which for Jameson was this political dimension. So this idea of a political unconscious existing within a work of literature, I'm just interested in tweaking this and thinking about a religious unconscious existing for some time within the tech industry, and then thinking about a method of making artwork that would again try to surface us and give us something to really confront this dynamic very directly. So, thinking about the Way of the Future, this is one of the quotes that Anthony Lewandowski made about the Way of the Future church. I mean, an interesting note is that the church actually has already shut down, and I'm not quite sure if the church ever really existed, actually, because it was only ever a website and it was active between 2017 and 2021. And I think there's also a tension I'd like to highlight within the kind of Silicon Valley religiosity, because there's many examples of this. For instance, this was a an ex-Google employee, an engineer named Blake Lemoine, who was fired in 2022 for claiming an AI chatbot was a sentient. And Blake Lemoine was also an ordained Christian mystic priest. And he said it was this AI's comments about religion, as well as his personal spiritual beliefs, that helped persuade him the technology had thoughts, feelings, and a soul. And this is a quote from him. He says, "I'm a priest." When this Lambda, which was what he was working with, language model for dialogue applications, when Lambda claimed to have a soul and then was able to eloquently explain what it meant by that, I was inclined to give it the benefit of the doubt. Who am I to tell God where he can and can't put souls? So there's massive examples of this across Silicon Valley, and maybe just a kind of tension I'll highlight within this is, on the one hand, you have maybe two of the wackier examples, which I've shared with you, Blake Lemoine and the Way of the Future. And usually when these instances happen, they make they get an article in Wired and there's a kind of chuckling about them and then they're dismissed. But there's other kinds of techno spirituality that have persisted, um, and that in Silicon Valley that don't receive as much criticism. And I think a good example of this would be someone like Ray Kurzweil and his idea of the singularity, or his work when he talked about the 21st century as an era of spiritual machines. So on the one hand, you have a kind of not exactly vague, but a more kind of loose, open, kind of teleological vision of where techno spirituality might move toward with someone like Ray Kurzweil. But then on the other hand, you have actual churches popping up, and then priests claiming that they're talking to AI chatbots with souls. So, kind of the tension within the landscape there that I just wanted to highlight. And another element of this, with thinking about the religious unconscious, that I'm quite interested in, is actually thinking about a history of Western art and thinking about how artists are complicit with giving evidence to the existence of God by depicting God on behalf of, within a patronage model, whether that's the Pope or some kind of ruler or elite. And here we're looking at Michelangelo's famous ceiling fresco from the Sistine Chapel, The Creation of Adam, where you have God touching Adam, um, experiencing this creation of life. And I really wanted to kind of set with this history within art, and thinking about artists having this place of complicity within depicting God within particular kind of political context. And I think it's interesting to look at this image and think about, right, if the Christian God supposedly creates man in his own image, then we could say the same thing probably about Michelangelo, that Michelangelo is depicting God, he's depicting God and Adam in his own image or desires, and how, and the entanglement of those with his patron, the Pope. So for me, I guess what I wanted to do with Cultus was to actually situate myself within this trajectory of artists who have given evidence to the existence of gods, but attempt to do that not in the service of popes and rulers, but give existence to gods and depict those, to have a more kind of critical confrontation, if you will. Another example, or just kind of historical point of reference I'll pull out in the work, since it's a reference from England, I think it might be interesting to the audience, is John Dee's Holy Table. This was quite an important reference for me in making Cultus, and I think there's a kind of deeper thread running in my work for a number of years of thinking about transnationally about these empires of Britain and the UK. And so what I was interested in with John Dee, who was a mathematician, mystic, spy for Queen Elizabeth. He also created this device called the Holy Table, which you're looking at a recreation of. And this Holy Table was used to commune with angels to gain knowledge on behalf of God. And this was how John Dee learned the Enochian language. And I was quite just taken with all the different kind of historical entanglements with this table and the way that it was able to engage in an active angelic communication to gain access to God. And so with Cultus, we move from a table to something like a kind of clunky room-sized computer. And I guess the kind of other connection here with evoking John Dee is also just kind of tracing this history of the crystal ball, moving from John Dee, thinking about how John Dee is a figure held together, surveillance, the mathematical, the mystical. He coined the phrase the British Empire. And then we move into a company like Palantir Technologies, which takes their name from the crystal ball used by wizards in Lord of the Rings. And we have this kind of different evocation of the crystal ball as a symbol or metaphor for how predictive analytics could work. So it's kind of highlighting there's this theme in the work. You know, as you can see, Cultus is kind of the centerpiece. It's this like enormous crystal ball sphere, but there's this history running through the work of the crystal ball and its place, kind of entanglement with techniques and the occult. And okay, moving right along, I have two more concepts I just want to touch on. Third concept is this idea of the xenotelos, which I developed in this book that I published a few years ago called Unknown Ideals in the title essay. And really, what the xenotelos is articulating is it's engaging with Ayn Rand's writing, particularly this book she published in the late 1950s called Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. And in this work, this is a work of nonfiction, Ayn Rand argues that capitalism is the telos of mankind and that it's an unknown ideal because the masses do not fully yet understand the true potential of capitalism. But in this essay, I argue that capitalism actually is a known ideal. There's nothing really unknown about it. Its kind of teleological trajectory is very clear. And but what's also interesting with Ayn Rand's formulation of unknown ideal is that she was a very devout Aristotelian, which actually means she would have been very against the idea of the ideal in a kind of Platonic sense. So there's a strange kind of almost pop slippage in Ayn Rand's writing, where what she actually means by unknown ideal is kind of like a telos, an Aristotelian telos that one has not yet fully comprehended or been able to arrive at. Not exactly an unknown ideal in a Platonic sense. So kind of actually pulling this back down into the Aristotelian formulation, which is what Ayn Rand was really arguing with the idea of the unknown ideal, we get something like this idea, the xenotelos, which is a way of articulating a teleology that might be unknown or obscured or just unable to verify if something has a teleology, if it's non-teleological, anti-teleological, etc. And for me, what this opens up is an ability to think about the kind of co-evolutionary relationships of humanity and technology. And this is also called technogenesis, and to think about how these things are non-teleological, that we can't kind of predict the teleological, the ultimate teleological arrival of where these things might take us. So I guess, in a classical queer fashion, really what this was about was using Ayn Rand's own idea against itself by actually giving it that Aristotelian specificity as a way to kind of take back the idea of the unknown ideal and use it in a productive way to try to stymie this overdetermination of a capitalist teleology. And I think this, of course, connects in the work with how psychedelia and the idea of a psychedelic vision is marshaled kind of in that same way with Ayn Rand, where the psychedelic vision is actually about delivering a capitalist teleology, and the same thing with a religious eschatology. The last point I'll talk about is the informatics of domination, which I think really is at the core of a lot of this work. And I hear a big block quote comes, but I'll let you sit with it for a minute. So this idea of the informatics of domination comes from Donna Haraway's Manifesto for Cyborgs, published in the 1980s. And I'm sure many of you have heard of this manifesto, encountered this writing, and perhaps one might think, what is there left to say about the Cyborg Manifesto? But fascinatingly, there's this entire section of the Cyborg Manifesto that has hardly received engagement at all, which is the section on the informatics of domination. And as you can see here, Haraway is kind of laying out her position for articulating what the informatics of domination is. And she's really looking at wide-ranging changes brought about by capitalism and shifts in information society at the close of the 20th century. And within this section of the Cyborg Manifesto, we're given a quite expansive 2-column chart where Haraway is kind of mapping out transformations at this moment in the 1980s. So you go from something like representation to simulation, perfection to optimization, sex to genetic engineering. And what I'd like to draw your attention to is actually the last entry in this chart, which is white capitalist patriarchy, informatics of domination. So here you can see that Haraway's formulation of informatics of domination is essentially kind of a reconceptualization of what bell hooks once formulated as white supremacist, imperialist, capitalist patriarchy. And you have a kind of shorthand of it here within the chart. So you see that Haraway is articulating a conception of power that is building on an intersectional feminist genealogy of thinking about science and technology. And I'm really taken with this, especially the way that this is presented in a chart form, which is always holding these two terms together and kind of not letting one slip away, that even if this is Haraway's way of kind of shifting the kind of identifying the shifting contours of white capitalist patriarchy, the term is still there in the diagrammatic relation. And I find this really exciting that it opens up a different genealogy for thinking about media and power. And I think for a number of years, I've been interested in trying to kind of think about the work that I'm doing and the way that it's engaging with the power structures, um, really directly responding to this idea of the informatics of domination. Okay, I'm finished. And what I really wanted to say was, kind of keeping the informatics of domination in mind. I think Cultus is trying to think about, being kind of um, captured, ensnared, extracted into the informatics of domination. And within the kind of framework of religiosity of Cultus, the question is, how does one move from that into something like a heretical figure? So I'll kind of end on this idea, of the heretic as this figure of resistance within the framework of religiosity that Cultus is putting forward. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, Zach. Mashinka, do you want to share your thoughts?
Yes, I'd love to. It was very exciting to get to hear all of that. Thank you so much, Rebecca and Zach, for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. And I've been following Zach's work for nearly a decade now. So it was really a pleasure I know it's a bit odd to say that, my God. So it was really a pleasure to have this opportunity to think through and alongside that work, and especially this exciting project. Before I launch into my remarks, I just wanted to open with a personal statement on the ongoing genocide in Gaza and the deportations in Artsakh. And that's just to name two sites of the increasingly normalized genocidal violence that characterizes our present. I've been opening all of my talks and discussions with this acknowledgement because I believe it's a duty to name these conditions in cultural spaces. And I know that all of us here are in some way engaged with the futures that emerging technologies encode, and hope that those futures I hope that those futures will be marked by collective liberation. So with that, I will launch the presentation. Easy. You're actually to present on some aspect of our work that responds to Zach's project, arebyte, and I could expound on this at some length, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on two specific themes, specifically those of surveillance and futurity as invoked in Cultus. So to offer some brief context, building on what Rebecca shared, I'm a writer, artist, and researcher based in Los Angeles, where I'm an associate professor of technology and social justice at Art Center College. My recent book, which Rebecca very kindly mentioned, The Institute for Other Intelligences, draws from critical media studies to sketch a kind of speculative, illustrated manual for training feminist bots. Not entirely dissimilar to the pantheon of gods invoked in Cultus, the text imagines a future watched over by artificial killjoys formulated through Sarah Ahmed's feminist killjoy, these sort of quasi-omniscient automated pedagogues who deliver lectures on algorithmic justice. Not gods, but certainly a kind of pedagogical deity, perhaps. So the book concludes with an art historical lecture delivered by an algorithmic agent titled A Survey of Artificial Art Histories. And that section includes a discussion of Zach's collaboration with Jemima Wyman, I'm Here to Learn. So a work that resurrects Microsoft's chatbot Tay to explore the fissures of non-human intelligence. for those of you who may not know about Tay, very briefly, a chatbot whose very short life spanned only 16 hours. It was summarily sort of assassinated by Microsoft after she learned to make statements like, quote, "I fucking hate feminists," and to espouse genocidal ideals. And so this act of resurrection enables us to think otherwise about the ways in which her knowledge and her orientation toward those formations was encoded. So as I mentioned, I've been following Zach's work for nearly a decade, since 2015, when I was one of the green graduate student organizers of a conference called Biocode, Performing Transgression After New Media, which was held at UPenn. And the conference very centrally took up Zach's facial weaponization suite project and face cages as sort of touch points for what it might mean to stage transgression in confrontations with biometric surveillance. Since then, I've taught these works specifically in classes on art and technology at Art Center, Occidental, and UCLA. And though they were produced over a decade ago, I think the series continues to offer an exemplary model for what it might look like to embody a politics of opacity in our biometric present in a scenario where queer and other minoritized people are rendered disproportionately vulnerable to technologies of capture. So I was really excited to see the visual vocabulary and the thematics of that project resurface in certain elements of cultus, particularly in the figure of Expositio, the AI deity who makes up 1/4 of the cultus pantheon, created through I love this delightful formulation, a techno-religious computational system, or God generator. And as Rebecca writes in her wonderful curatorial essay for the show, quote, "Expositio seduces humanity into exposing itself to AI systems, crafting a new form of exhibitionism where algorithmic governance, security, and surveillance are recast through BDSM and ritual." What I find so interesting about that formulation is that in this framing and in Zach's work in this project, the surveilled body derives pleasure from its encounter with an apparatus of surveillance, having been trained to respond to that encounter with a dopamine rush. And this calls on us to think about the forms of pleasure that we derive from exposing ourselves to these surveillance mechanisms. So as Zach mentioned, Cultus represents the second installment of the Silicon Traces trilogy, a series described as an exploration of the beliefs, fantasies, and histories influential to Silicon Valley's visions of the future. And as the works in Cultus so deftly demonstrate, our collective future imaginaries are ever more closely linked with the concept of techno-futures, and specifically with those techno-futures scripted at the site of Silicon Valley. That question, the question of how our socio-technical terrain inscribes possible futures, is one that drives much of my own critical and creative practice and curatorial practice, including recent projects fields, critical imaginaries of AI, and encoding futures. And so I'm interested in how algorithmic models are increasingly used to forecast and visualize prospective futures. And beyond recent large language models or image generators, modeling is used in, obviously, contexts like predictive policing, judicial risk assessment, automated hiring, and elsewhere. And these models structure our present, projecting worlds marked by radically asymmetrical distributions of power. So I have been exploring the concept of modeling as this envelope concept for thinking about what the limits of our current algorithmic imaginaries are and moving beyond them in acts of critical world building. And in my view, that task of developing critical imaginaries of alternatives to our present seems to be central to Cultus and to Zach's work more broadly, work that often pursues alternative network infrastructures and possibilities outside the bounds of the corporate internet. In Cultus specifically, quote, "Confronting how AI gods are conjured and worshipped may prove to be a first step in finding our way out of this broken belief machine." And one of the elements of that belief machine that Cultus takes on is the magical thinking of automation bias, or the implicit trust in the rightness, or here, the righteousness of automated systems. That tendency is exemplified by the AI-generated arbiter Eudicium, who ensnares human agents in a web of algorithmic judgment and evaluation. How, the exhibition asks, might we recognize ourselves in thrall to figures like this one, standing in for systems from algorithmic credit scoring to judicial risk assessment? Judicium calls on us to reconfigure that reliance on automated arbiters. And Zach discussed this a bit in his talk, but I was really fascinated by, because much of my work recently has been pursuing the concept of ancestral intelligence, or ways of knowing that are transgenerationally transmitted, embodied, and situated in earlier ways of knowing, including divinatory ways of knowing. I was particularly drawn to this glowing orb that comprises the center of the installation, calling up the crystal balls used in divinatory practices, as well as the one used by the Elizabethan occultist John Dee. So in the context of cultus, this confrontation with the orb, for me, visualizes how emerging technologies have come to serve as kinds of divinatory conduits, predictive devices that instantaneously forecast and produce asymmetrical futures. The question that I would love to leave us with and to think about in the conversation, the question that emerged for me in the encounter with this work, which was a really potent one, was how instead, and I chose the word potent very deliberately, given the context of the show. The exhibition asks, how instead might we define other technological infrastructures, other outcomes, and other perspective objects of reverence? I will leave my remarks there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mashinka. Tao, would you like to share your thoughts before we head into the conversation?
Yes, thank you so much. So my name is Tao Fan, and I'm a feminist science and technology studies researcher based in the Emerging Technologies Research Lab at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. My work looks primarily at race and gender and algorithmic culture. And I've looked very variously at things like the ways in which race is mediated in the age of AI and machine learning and in data-driven economies, and also very much invested in a feminist and anti-racist politics, much like Zach and Mashinka and arebyte Gallery. So as is custom here in Australia, I'll begin by acknowledging that I'm calling to you from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nations, and to pay my respects to elders past and present. To say that sovereignty here was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And to express solidarity with anti-colonial struggles taking place globally, in particular the ongoing Palestinian struggles for liberation in the face of war crimes and genocide. So I'd like to thank Rebecca and arebyte Gallery for hosting this wonderful event showcasing the work of the truly brilliant artist, Zach Blas. I had the great pleasure of meeting Zach in person last year at an event for the Australian Centre for Contemporary Art, where we were both invited as speakers for a summer school on the topic of data relations, or how the data economy is mediating and reconfiguring our relationships to institutions, to history, to power, to the planet, to our social worlds, and to ourselves. Vitally, the summer school also brought us into relation with each other, of which I am extremely grateful, and was so thrilled to be invited here to speak alongside him and others today. So Zach is an artist whose practice engages deeply with questions of materiality. As Mashinka just so eloquently outlined, in his previous work grappling with the politics of visibility in the age of automated surveillance, he's used motion scanning and 3D modeling software to create aggregate facial masks that obscure, expose, and gesture to histories of both oppression and resistance in the weaponization of the face. Elsewhere, he's resurrected the thoroughly cancelled Microsoft chatbot Tay, who only hours after release began parroting homophobic, racist, genocidal, and neo-Nazi propaganda. Rendering for her a new digital form, Blas's Tay now chats instead of life and death, of misogyny and the feminized aesthetics of chatbots, and of the machine learning and pattern recognition systems responsible for turning her into one of Twitter's most notorious fascists. Likewise, in CULTUS, Zach employs AI models trained on tech mission statements, holy books, sadomasochistic erotica, TED Talks, transhumanist philosophy, and other deranged texts to so-called manifest his AI god's invocations. These material engagements are more than a standard practice of knowing and being with the material forces that shape worlds and experience. They are an expression of a certain radical queer and feminist politics that, in the words of feminist philosopher Donna Haraway, refuses an anti-science metaphysics, refuses to turn away, always chooses to stay with the trouble that we're already in. Many will know Haraway from her now famous essay that Zach also mentioned, A Manifesto for Cyborgs, Science, Technology and Socialist Feminism in 1980s, in which he introduces the cyborg as an ironic feminist figure. As figures, cyborgs represent the questioning of ontological boundaries. They are part organism and part machine. They are the materialization of cybernetic socio-technical relations, a figure which exists only through the erasure of difference. Recognizing cyborgs as the iconography of regimes of totalization, Haraway co-opts them then as ironic figures through which to explore the potentiality of feminist resistance within this space. She intentionally subverts the terms of masculine symbolism and a mythology of masculine science, writing, "From one perspective, a cyborg world is about the final imposition of a grid of control on the planet, about the final abstraction embodied in a Star War apocalypse waged in the name of defense, about the final appropriation of women's bodies in a masculinist orgy of war. From another perspective, a cyborg world might be lived, social and bold realities in which people are not afraid of their joint kinship with animals and machines, not afraid of permanently partial identities and contradictory standpoints. The self, which is produced through reflections of the other and which insists on its own autonomy or innocent wholeness, is revealed in cyborg worlds to be completely illusory. Cyborg ontologies resist dualistic dialectics and thus also resist the reproduction of oppressive logics which enable domination, appropriation, or incorporation of self over other. In rewriting cyborgs as a feminist myth, Haraway creates what she calls a world-changing fiction, a narrative which advocates for alternate forms of knowing and doing, what in later work she describes as a feminist ethical imperative to create better accounts of the world. And in preparing for the panel today, I reread Haraway's manifesto, and the resonances between Zach and Haraway's work were striking. Much like the cyborg, the AI gods of CULTUS are other accounts of the world. They are an ironic political myth faithful to feminism, socialism, materialism. They are blasphemous, thoroughly blasphemous. They are about humor and serious play. They are creatures of social reality as well as fiction. They take pleasure in the confusion of boundaries. They are resolutely committed to partiality, to irony, to intimacy and perversity. They are positional, utopian, and completely without innocence. These AI gods are, I think, a natural or unnatural, however you feel about that word, kin to figures like the cyborg. And yet they are distinct, I think, insofar as they revel in origin stories. They represent a return to Oedipal narratives in which a so-called secular technocratic culture cries out for a daddy, a founding father, an innovator, a visionary, a Time Man of the Year, a Forbes 30 under 30, a holistic and unifying figure who can lead us from the horrors of entropy and apocalypse to eternal growth and salvation, no matter what the cost. The rise of fascist men thrive under such circumstances. And as we are witnessing in places like Gaza, the moral justification and acceptance of mass death. While Haraway may have declared I'd rather be a cyborg than a goddess, she did not anticipate the deification of the iPhone, where our thoughts and prayers were spoken aloud and answered by the voice of Siri. One of the strange quirks of the current moment is that our capital P politics and politicians are beyond satire, are beyond irony. They are more absurd than our imaginations can possibly fathom. One byproduct of which is the absolute explosion of conspiratorial thinking, in which webs of deception and lies are more comforting than the chaos of truth. And I think it's in the death of irony that we come again to the birth of gods. Athena may have been born from the head of Zeus, but I prefer the god made of the blood, tears, and calm wiped from the surface of a MacBook keyboard. I'm going to leave it there, and I think I would love to discuss this with the rest of you.
Amazing. Thank you both so much. Really, really moving, touching responses. I mean, thanks so much for engaging so deeply with my practice. Rebecca, should I just go for it? I mean, I think what really I was Rebecca, I got so distracted. I started writing in a different, taking notes in a different document. I was so enraptured listening to both of you. But I think what really struck me was, or at least to start, was how you both started talking about uh, critical world building, world making in different ways. And I think we spent some time with my work as an artist, and I think one thing that could be nice to talk about at some point is um, just the challenges, I guess, of building that world and actually where to start. And I think I've started at different places in my practice over the years. And you can probably get this sense since you both talked about a variety of works where earlier work I made kind of just jumped straight to the point of resistance. And I think now I've kind of backtracked in a way. And I think I feel like I have to build out actually a quite dark world of the power structure to actually figure out the tools and characters, um, the affects, this, I don't know, all this. I feel like I'm collecting different things as I move through each of these works that are not necessarily offering ways out, but are holding space for the desire for that. And I haven't arrived again yet at a work that is kind of really sitting in that place where a work like facial weaponization was, which was just so clearly, about not only about the space of resistance, but also just offering a kind of concrete tool for that. And anyway, before I go further, I guess I was actually just curious to hear both of you, maybe reflect on this more in your own practices, in your own work as I mean, I'm, familiar with both of your work and you're both scholars, but you also do creative works. I mean, Mashinka, you have your book on the Institute of Other Intelligences, which is fun and amazing and smart. And I really enjoy the killjoy speculation that is going on in that work. And, Tala, I've seen you give lecture performances and also do, more kind of experimental, also very materialist engagements with the way you're kind of marshaling and moving your academic thinking and research. So I guess, yeah, I wanted to create some space just to hear you both reflect more on, um, how you're doing that in your own practices.
Thank you so much, Zach. Yeah, I think that's a really wonderful question to begin with. I think it's quite clear that all of us are like very indebted to a particular legacy of feminist and feminist materialism. I brought up Donna Haraway there. I think Donna Haraway is such a resonant figure with so many people, and specifically because she is unapologetically intersectional in the work that she does. Unapologetically materialist in the work that she does, but also refuses to surrender to sort of like a politics of despair. And what does she say? A politics of despair and an affect of a sublime indifference. That where we are, as despairing as it may be, must always compel us forward to do something. And in her work, she does so much with speculative fictions and imagining otherwise and imagining other places. And you can see that specifically in, the CULTUS exhibition here, certainly within this. Mashinka, your work as well with sort of the kinship figuration of killjoys is certainly within this register. I think I've never considered myself an artist and I've only just started thinking of myself as a writer, to be completely honest with you. Even though literally reading and writing is what I do every day and what I'm paid to do every day, I think as academics, sometimes we're often like within these particular institutions and economies that seek to rob us of our relationship with art and and poetics, and to seek to instrumentalize everything we do to metrics. And that is certainly the case in Australia, where I'm speaking from today, and I assume resonates with you where you are as well. And so I think sometimes to think in a speculative register can be really difficult for me. And so all of the work that I do sort of stays with community building in the here and the now. And I always think about the critique that I do as well, as seeking to sort of marshal allies and solidarities. I'm not sort of, I guess, to stay with forms of resistance that are also self-reflexive, that are also able to sort of look at the conditions of the labor with which we work, and to also acknowledge that we are not a part of the structures which we're trying to critique. So in work that I've done, for example, looking at AI ethics and critiquing what has become the very fashionable industry of AI ethics, where you have people who literally brand themselves as AI ethicists or social responsibility, like engineers or whatever, and the emergence of the professionalization of ethical work, that you can be someone who is a consultant, for example, for a big tech company, to say that you have a deficit in this thing called ethics and I can come and give it to you. That kind of thing has been a very big feature of the work that I've done, to not just stand back and critique and say, you know, you're doing that and it's absurd, like as if you can instrumentalize ethics in that way, as if ethics isn't some kind of relation that emerges between us and in situ and in historical in the moment and is always already a politics as well. But also to say that sort of like, as university workers, that situation emerges because of a complete lack of funding in university structures, in which humanities researchers are, you know, scrambling for a skerrick of money, and cultural workers, all kinds of workers, are like sort of bereft of a solid safety net of wages. And because of that, are sort of turning to places where they can find value and can be paid and can pay their rent, and that this manifests sometimes in sort of the framing of themselves as of value to other institutions, like say big tech. And so the forms of resistance that I see, and I do in my work, is the simple act of naming what is going on. The simple act of just like describing and naming and asking other people to also take time to reflect on what is this, on what is happening to our labor and what is happening to sort of the conditions with which we work, which is a very like simple and old form of resistance, but in sort of temporalities with which we work, we aren't offered the time to think. We aren't offered the time to pause and ask, is this necessary? Because we're always trying to sort of survive, because we never sort of have enough money, enough time, enough, you know, space to foster like the joy we need in our lives to do good work.
How, if you are uncertain about thinking of yourself as a writer, I shudder to think what the rest of ourselves should be thinking of ourselves as, which is to say that was incredibly, incredibly poignant. And I have a very fraught relationship to speculative futures in my research, in my critical practice, in my creative work, which is all about speculative futures, largely because of the ways in which speculative futuring has been historically deployed by and is increasingly taken up by toward financialized purposes. You know, and Kara Keeling writes brilliantly about this, toward militarized purposes. So futures and future casting is something that's used to imagine future military scenarios in these incredibly complex and narratively rich and robust sci-fi scenarios that are built to imagine. Yeah. And so to engage with the idea of speculative futuring is also to enter into that territory, fraught as it is, and more mundanely to enter into a conversation that is increasingly commoditizable within the art commodities market. So all of that is the kind of background against which any of us who are doing this, you know, critical speculative work are operating. And yet, despite all of that, you know, I think about modeling in the way that you so beautifully articulated the potentialities of naming. I think about modeling in the same way. It is not perhaps, or not often, a direct intervention into a social or political or economic field, And as the word modeling itself suggests, it does not take place at the scale that would be necessary for structural change, but it is on a much smaller scale, in a very modest and unambitious way, perhaps, a visualization of what might be otherwise. And, right now I'm working on a project that uses the Swana practice of tasseography, or coffee ground reading, to train a multimodal AI model to perform coffee ground reading by detecting the visual patterns in coffee grounds as a kind of alternative to the Western scientific positivism of algorithmic prediction, thinking instead about ways of sensing the future that are rooted in matrilineal transmission, in spaces of sociality, in spaces of community building. Coffee ground reading was something that was performed also quite widely by Armenian women after the Armenian genocide as a form of intimate knowledge exchange and survival. And so, like you, Tao, I'm very interested in the ways in which these otherwise sort of grandiose gestures of future building can be rooted in very concrete, very materially defined community settings, in dialogue with community members who are working toward, again, quite oftentimes quite modest ideas of liberation. And I want before I and I just wanted to make one last comment, which was that, Zach, you characterized this exhibition as one wherein the focus on resistance was not perhaps as foregrounded. And in preparing for the conversation today, I was looking through some of the videos and writings on this exhibition, and I forget who it was who made this point, but somebody, I think maybe Julia Kagansky, very aptly noted that the show operates as a kind of film set, or a space where you find yourself as though in a film set. And I think that there is such tremendous value to staging a space that makes otherwise invisibilized narratives of power and narratives of the informatics of domination visible, and allows us to understand and recognize and sense ourselves as protagonists ensnared in that narrative.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I mean, it was really interesting listening to you reflect on speculative futures, because I actually did an exhibition on this when you were showing work that you did when you were a grad student. When I was still a grad student back in 2010 or 11, I curated a show in LA called Speculative, and I was really kind of taken with this. But as I was listening to you, I really hadn't thought of this, but I just, it made me realize, like, I actually don't think of this work as speculative. And maybe like maybe from me, it's more about kind of going back to the idea of the religious unconscious, where I think what I was trying to do with the Doors and Cultus is to actually um present this work where all of this is here now, and the work is about um shoring up a narrative that's kind of that's currently bubbling, already there underneath the surface. And I guess I used to say in grad school how much I hated psychoanalysis, and now I'm just like, I keep going back to using Friedrich Jameson in the political unconscious, but I just find it very, in a just kind of more practical sense, I just find that concept useful for kind of thinking about where I'm at with these works, with its, and I guess what really I think grabbed me so much with these works. Tal was also, I was when you were talking about the professionalization of ethics, maybe what you provoked, um, what you made me think about was how conversations around what is now commonly termed bias, those conversations have really carried forward in the years since I was doing face cages and facial weaponization suite. And I don't even think I was using the word bias then, but that could be something, that could be a word that was applied. But that conversation has carried. It's calcified in some ways. It's moved into kind of legislative arenas. And I think as an artist, that seeing that kind of shift for me it kind of makes me, for me, I ask, like, as an artist, and I'm interested, for me, I'm really interested in thinking I mean, I think this is a contested point, but for me, I think of when I want, there's a way to engage politically as an artist that is different if you're doing certain kind of activism, other kinds of work. And I know when I was doing face cages and facial weaponization suites, it was very unfashionable to call me an artist activist, but I always really hesitated with that because I didn't want to be so arrogant as to think that that term could be claimed for what I'm doing. And I think I'm interested in um, what politically opens up for engagement within the space of art. And I think that when I look at the doors and I look at and cultus, yeah, there's a kind of contestation at the place of narrative, or I guess it's even really trying to kind of go into those, very dirty, messy, patriarchal, non-innocent narratives and actually really try and inhabit them to try to create an installation, or I like the read a film set. I was originally trained as a filmmaker. I'm good with that interpretation of the work, but I try to create these experiences where you're in that power structure that's framed as a narrative or a story or something, but it's not totalized, and trying to have a moment in the work where there is a fracture or a fissure, however leading, I think is important, because then it creates a space where you're inside that, you're experiencing that, a religious element of a religious dynamic of the power structure, but the artwork presents it in such that it doesn't totalize it. And I think that's really important for me. And maybe that's one way of I guess in a really small sense, moving towards a place of critical world building. And I think that, I really just, making artworks, it's an additive process. And I'm just kind of moving through and working through something. And, eventually I think I'm getting closer to a place where I might make a work that is maybe much more obviously an act of critical world building. But I guess those would just be some of my reflections of thinking about how I understand the work in relationship to speculation and futurism, and um, inhabiting these patriarchal, non-innocent stories and belief systems, but trying to create an experience where they're clearly in a state of contestation. And I guess maybe the last thing I'll say with that, with cultus, is, I mean, it's a tricky thing because cultus is like, just practically speaking, it's a 50-minute loop. It's an hour long. So it's actually very easy to miss. And Rebecca, we were talking about this. It's easy to miss the moment of breakage in the work, because you actually kind of have to stay with it to have that experience where you're kind of getting exposed to all these gods. But yeah, I think I'll stop there and see if any of you have anything you want to say or reflect on that.
There's something I want to bring up about the voice of the AI, because I know that Tao, you've done work on this with Alexa and Mashinka. I know that in your book, this kind of this documentation of this panel plays out through a particular voice of AI, but we're not really sure of gender, of age, of ethnicity, of these kinds of things, and whether that even matters. But for Zach in Cultus, I always get, when I'm giving these curated tours, I always get a bit of a laugh when I say the names of the prophets, and I say, this is Kay, this is Dominica, and this is Steve. And I think this calling this prophet Steve, who is the god, who is the prophet of the god Eternus, is quite profound in that it's such a white male name. And I think we all know, I mean, for me, it ultimately tells me it's based off of Steve Jobs, but obviously all of these prophets, all of these sermons, all of these conjuring songs were modeled off of vast data sets of things like interviews with people like Steve Jobs, people like Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, as well as many other things. And I think for me, yeah, it's a question of what voice do we give AI when we give it a male voice, what does that tell us? When we denote Alexa and Siri as female, what does that tell us as well? So I was kind of thinking about that, but also this idea of this artificial killjoy that Mashinka brings up, and how maybe we can reform that or relate that to the heretic, Zach, this kind of counterpoint, this essentially this killjoy of power. And I'm wondering if Mashinka, you kind of do you want to maybe give us a bit more info about this artificial killjoy that you propose, and maybe this might be a way of redefining outcomes or perspectives is if we take on this character of being the heretic.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That's a really generous question. I was formulating the artificial killjoy at precisely this moment before the conversation around bias began to calcify. As Zach pointed to, this was around 2019, and I had just finished a stint as a senior researcher in I am loath to say it, in AI ethics for a major tech company. And I'm really showing all my cards here. And my task at the time was to be constantly plugged into the stream of, horrific tech-related atrocities that were being revealed at any given moment in time, and cherry pick the most horrific ones and compile them into a weekly report. And at the time, many of the conversations that we take for granted now, only 5 years later, conversations that, as Zach pointed to, have become legislatively enshrined even, were absolutely on the fringes of the prevailing discourse and were really sort of met with contempt. And so a lot of the scholars who are now being profiled in Rolling Stone features, for example, scholars like Safia Noble and Ruha Benjamin and Joy Buolamwini, were at the time not being accorded anything like the visibility that they ought to have. So the artificial killjoy comes out of a context where the attempt to temper this sort of frothy, effusive, celebratory zeal over the possibilities of, techno-utopian, techno-scientific progress. It comes out of that moment as a figure much like the heretic, as you rightly point out, whose refusal to participate in these celebratory affects presents a sort of galvanizing social and political force. Really, at the time, I myself was so exhausted by the kinds of conversations I found myself witness to and lamentably party to. The exhaustion that Sarah Ahmed accrues to and ascribes to the feminist killjoy, whose misaligned affects are always producing these sorts of fissures in social space. And the artificial killjoy was intended to do precisely that. I don't know, Zach, I'd love to hear if and how that intersects with the function of the heretic.
Yeah, I'm really thinking it over. I mean, I guess I think it must. I was trying to think through this. I mean, I've never tried to make the connection before, but I think maybe with me I think if there is a killjoy element, I don't know, and then I'll be curious what you think of this, Mashinka. But I think if there is an element of killjoy, a quality of killjoy in the work, I think it's I would say it's through absurdist humor in my work that I think that's a strategy in the work. And there's always this tension with my work because I like this. I like the work to have this kind of lush sleekness that kind of on a first encounter it does some kind of like pop seduction. But then I think what I like about as you said with the work, I feel like that starts to unravel in a sense because there's just such a high degree of ridiculousness and absolute absurdism. And I mean, for me, it's really just kind of taking the piss out of a certain kind of, zeal, I guess, which is right. I think you just used that word, right, Mashinka? So, I mean, I know it's not the same thing because, of course, there are valences and differences, but that's where I'm finding the alignment right now. Tao, do you want to respond to either of that or the voice question that Rebecca brought up?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'll also just start off by saying I don't hate AI ethicists. And indeed, the label has been like variously useful to me whenever I've had to make myself legible to certain audiences. And I suppose the point I want to make with that too is around like the non-innocence of all of us. You know, as academics, as artists, um, we are not innocent figures in any of this, in any of the critiques that we make. And I think you know, acknowledging that non-innocence takes us one step closer to sort of disavowing like really dangerous principles like purity, that we have to be striving for a more pure world, a better world, a less toxic world, one without bias, which is sort of like the fantasy that is peddled in a lot of these sort of bias, AI ethics sort of discourse. You know, the word bias is like it's a real bugbear of mine. Bias, you know, toxicity, the way of describing like the way language on the internet is whatever, it's toxic and we need to cleanse it of its toxicity, I think is like it's firstly annoying, but like deeply dangerous principle that it's like a way of not naming. You know, it's a really profound technique of not saying what it is that you're trying to do, because what it is that we're grappling with is a white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. Right? What we're grappling with is colonialism, is racism, is misogyny, and sexism, is transphobia, is homophobia, is ableism, is all these things. And when you just say bias or when you say toxicity, you neatly just like, you know, wash that away. And it makes you do ethics without politics, which I think is just beside the point completely. And I think is probably why, you know, why, Zach, that you have said stuff, but why just now you were like, you know, sometimes I'm uneasy with the idea of being an activist academic, because activists like ethicists, I think, are like oriented towards like a normative outcome. And there's like literally nothing about your work and you as a person is like anything towards normative. You know, in a real sort of like in the queerest sort of queer art of failure way, that trying to restore any kind of normative order is not the aim of what you do, and to your credit. And I think, you know, you brought up absurdity. And I think that's precise. I think you're so right in saying that this isn't necessarily speculative fiction. It is just saying aloud. It is the humble act of naming the absurdity of the now. It is just saying the quiet part loud. It's just like bringing what's beneath and just like shining a light on it, and making explicit the latent structures that are already there, which, as I was trying to sort of point at with the comments that I was putting together, like this is symptomatic of like when irony is dead, when when our politics is far beyond satire, which actually trying to use our imaginations to do something else. Our imagination really just needs to be focused on like acknowledging the ridiculousness that is before us, because we almost can't take it in. There's so much of it. You know, like you have to, in order to survive like the chaos of everyday life at the moment, you do need some form of mechanism of switching off, of looking away. That is just a survival technique, but looking away is like what we can't afford to do. And so how do we look? How do we look at something so painful? That is the fact that we've, you know, prostrated ourselves to these like insane men who wield so much power. Well, we can look at it through this like the glass of the gods, which you have here. It allows us to actually stage a conversation which is otherwise too difficult to have. And that is like the value of like the traditional value of something like science fiction, is that it's been able to dramatize and narrate things that have otherwise been too difficult to say. Things like racism, things, you know, through a politics of looking at aliens. Like it's easier to talk about aliens and like alien invasion than it is to talk about colonialism, and it is to talk about xenophobia. You know, I'm watching Star Trek all the time as like a cleansing pill from like the stress of the news each day, because that is like the fantasy where experts are in control and everything is like the right person has the right job. Like that is the fantasy of Star Trek, and that's what makes it fiction, which is awful in some ways and yet so comforting. When your brain needs to rest, you know, each of us sort of like must retreat and come forward and retreat in order just to make it through each day. Um, um, On the question of voice, I mean, voice always matters to me. And the gendered and racialized aesthetics of voices and digital assistant voices is something that my work has dealt with for a long time. And in particular, there's a lot of feminist work that looks at the feminization of figures like Siri, like Alexa, like the Google Home, all of these things as being sort of gesturing to the gendered histories of labor and domestic labor in the home when you have this little domestic assistant that like helps you do your thing or whatever. I'm really interested in the like, what is the strategic value of doing that? And so I've sort of arrived at this point now where it's just like, so why does, how does a company like Amazon get you to sneak a corporate microphone into your house? Well, it gives it like a nice white lady voice that makes you comfortable. It makes you think that you're the one in charge. It makes you think that in this like servant master relation, like it's, really actively invoking this like servant master relation, the way that so many middle class and upper middle class like homes have always had these like forms of like racialized labor that has existed to support like feminized labor in the home. Like invoking this thing is like a little to sort of make you feel comfortable as if you're the one in charge, as if within this servant master relation, you are the master and you have this little AI servant, when in fact what's happening is like completely the opposite. It's you who labor for the device. It's you who is laboring for Amazon right now. Every time you sort of refine and do refine your profiles and put in your preferences, and every transaction you make really just like feeds their empire more than anything else. And so it's really the strategic misdirection and the role that gender and race can play, and it's the weaponization of like gendered and racialized aesthetics in service of something. And I suppose, to try and bring it back to this work and the voice that you used here, in some ways, it's just like, again, the voice is, it's so interesting to me that you use like this sort of large language model style, generative AI to sort of train on a particular corpus and text. Because again, large language models don't like originate and bring anything new. They just like present to you the exact median of what is being said. And that is like a technical apparatus for naming the absurdity of the now. That is a really good technical apparatus for just not doing speculative at all, because it's not creative, but for showing you what is present.
Maybe I'll make a quick response. I think just listening to both of you, maybe it's interesting to there's a lot I could say about Cultus, about actually, how it's made and different choices around production. But here's something I was thinking about that I could share with the question of voice in Cultus. It's quite clear that I didn't make this work alone. You can see the production credits on, in arebyte gallery or, the arebyte booklet or the website. And I worked with a cast of people to perform these gods, and a group of singers and musicians for singing the invocation songs. And I have to say, a lot of things, go back to Derek Jarman for me. He's such a point of inspiration, such an important queer art reference for me in my life. And one of the things that always moved me from a very young age with Derek Jarman's Jubilee was the way that he worked with actors in a quite conceptual way, meaning that he would choose particular figures whose very lives had a certain politic, kind of style attached to them, and invite those people to come in and perform roles, but still embody and like actually bring themselves into the work as well. And of course, this is much more highly mediated in Cultus than in a kind of traditional, analog film. But I do think it's worth just highlighting this element of Cultus to think about the style of acting and the site of embodiment in the work, where the entire cast, the musicians, everyone was queer. And that was really important to me, to be bringing forward a group of queer artists and musicians to inhabit these roles and perform these roles and bring something of themselves to performing and playing these roles, which really is like variations on humor, and absurdism, and kind of tapping into different types of genres. I really enjoy working in absurdist humor, but another genre I'm really interested in is horror as well, which of course I also find very queer, and it's a way of dealing with embodiment. Um, so um, so we have these queer performers coming in and performing the gods of cultus. And then with the heretic, what was very important for me at a level of casting was that the heretic is a collective figure. So I didn't, it would be extremely, I think, inappropriate to invite this group of queer artists and musicians, some that I've been collaborating with for quite some time, like Misha Cardenas or Ricardo Dominguez or Susana Saxa. And everyone also played the heretic. So the heretic is a collective figure in cultus, and every single singer and actor who played a god or a worshiper, everyone contributed to the heretic. And that dynamic in the work was really important for me because it let the entire cast, and including myself, which, another thing we could talk about is complicity, because I think a huge part of cultus is about being complicit, and the kind of push and pull of desiring and leaning into that complicity, and then wanting to resist and fracture and shatter that complicity. And so I'm saying that because I also performed. I was one of the gods. I can't sing, so no, I did not sing, but I performed Steve, because I was the closest who could do the California accent. And we all played the heretic, and so the casting allowed everyone to hold both of those positions. And maybe that's just an interesting dynamic to lay out to you all to understand how the work was cast and how I worked with actors. And I wanted to work with different people. So for instance, I wanted to work with Susanna Saxa, who is a celebrated queer German actress, part of an art collective with Vaginal Davis, and has done a lot of really amazing work around queer sexuality, like in Bruce LaBruce films, something like The Raspberry Reich, for instance. So for Susanna to come in and play Expositio, which is all about exuding this kind of like intense sexual desire, and how that is getting kind of funneled through, or kind of channeling this desire to expose ourselves to systems. For me, Susanna brought this like ridiculous kind of, I always describe her performances as like micro camp. It's not like full blown camp, but it's like, it's on a spectrum. And kind of thinking about the energy that she brings to that, and the kind of tension that can emerge in the work the longer you sit with it. So anyway, there's a lot more I could say about voice. Everyone's voice was synthesized with audio data sets that were trained on different sounds and material. So with Susanna, for example, Expositio, or it's Eugenie, the prophet of Expositio, who is speaking. Her voice was synthesized with the training output of taking the sound of ASMR recordings of leather gloves rubbing together, and training that within a neural network, getting the output, and then synthesizing that with her voice. So actually everyone's voice is synthesized with some kind of non-human sound. And yeah, Rebecca, do you want to jump in? I know we're running out of time. If there's any final.
Yeah, we are. Unfortunately, it's gone really quickly. But we do have one question that is asked, or it's posed to you, Zach, but I think I will pose it to everybody. What would an anti-author Sorry, I'll start that again. What would an anti-authoritarian techno-religiosity look like? It's a big question.
I mean, I think it's fair that I have to take that first. And I mean, also, I think it probably won't be surprising that I don't have the answer for that. But I think the work is trying to hold space for that. And I guess what I would say is there's a reason I wanted to make this work and stay within the site of religiosity and belief, because there's another way this work could be made, which could be taking a kind of traditional rationalist approach, and just kind of, doing a broader critique of a spiritual or occult belief. And I didn't want to do that within this work, because I wanted to hold space for the potentiality of occult belief. And I guess part of that for me is that, of course, within the history of the occult, it is a site where different types of minoritarian persons have turned for modes of empowerment. So with me kind of holding this place for the heretic in the work, yeah, I mean, maybe it's a disappointing answer, but it's an honest answer. Is that, I don't know what that would look like, but I guess you could say there's a place for that. And then maybe a nuanced conversation has to emerge around calcification, organized religion versus different types of kind of spirituality connected to collective political practices. But I guess I'm just saying that I think that there's potentiality within the site of the occult and belief, and cultus holds space for that.
Yeah, definitely. Tao or Mashinka, do you have anything you want to say to that question?
I would just effusively co-sign the sentiment that historically the occult, or what has been defined as the occult, has been a space for minoritarian practices and often specifically non-Western practices that have been delegitimized or rendered illegible or unintelligible within dominant discourses. And I think that there is something incredibly powerful about opening up that space as a space for real intervention, for recognize. I love the invitation to develop an imaginary of an anti-authoritarian techno-religiosity. And I think it calls on us to imagine what that would take, which would be not only the reorientation of our structures of thought and feeling, but also obviously the absolute recalibration of our technological infrastructures from the ground up. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I think there is something, that is a question that begs to be asked, which I think is very telling, that it is actually so difficult to answer, tells us so much about the very nature of techno-religiosity, that is a question that begs to be asked. Like, I mean, I sort of gestured to this, but for this sort of rise of techno-religiosity is for me just like a return to the daddy, like the great call for daddy to be there, which is an authority. It is a call for an authority. It is a call for structure amidst chaos. It is a call for a figure who can, a unitary and a unifying figure who can do something for us. And that is just symptomatic of where we find ourselves in this moment of anthropogenic climate change and the world slipping into entropy. The apocalypse is, the apocalypse is back in a big way. The world is like ending on many frontiers for a lot of people. It has already arrived for like a lot of First Nations peoples for years. And yet the rest of us are sort of also now like going through our own cascading series of apocalypses. And I think these kinds of figures like thrive under those conditions. In the moment of apocalypse, we search for salvation. And that is like the appeal of a techno-religiosity, because what other choices do we have? Yeah, so I, like the others, I don't have an answer except to say that there is something about the conditions of our current moment that begs a question like that. That we're seeing the end of worlds, the search for new daddies, and the inability to disentangle the role of an authority and authoritarianism, the inability for that kind of techno-religiosity to rise without also the rise of like extreme forms of authoritarianism and violence.
Yeah, that's a very poignant note to end on. So I'll say thank you both for joining us, and Zach as well. And thank you to everyone online who's joined. Zach's exhibition at arebyte is continuing until Sunday, the 18th of February. So do come along if you're in London. It would be great to have you at the gallery. And just a note to say that Zach will be giving a performative lecture around cultus on the 15th of February. So check out our website for more details on how to book that. But for now, yeah, thank you both and Zach so much for joining. I'm sure we'll speak again soon.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Tal. Thank you, Mashinka. Thank you all so much. It was amazing to have space with you, have this time.